By Mike Needham from the Needham Group. He's helping us with a lot of our HR and hazard communications and our employee records, things like that. So the first one's on hazardous communications, and with that, I will turn you over to Mike.
Thank you and good morning. Once again, my name is Mike Needham, and I'm a safety and health professional, and I'd like to welcome you to our program on chemical hazard communication. And the goal this morning is we're going to review an Occupational Safety and Health Administration regulation, which has been around since about 1986. And the idea behind this regulation is fairly simple. It's that employees have a fundamental right to ask for and receive information about chemical hazards in the workplace. And this has gone through some changes recently. The United Nations got together and really wanted to enhance the labeling systems that we use worldwide. So we've made some changes in these requirements, and we're going to talk about them. There's now a set of what we call pictograms or pictures that we're going to use to help people understand different types of chemical hazards. And this has real meaning as you go from country to country. For example, if we're in Brazil, I don't speak Portuguese, but it would be nice if I could look at a label and know something about the hazards. So we'll talk a little bit about these changes as we move through this program as well. You're about to receive a training acknowledgement form, and if you're receiving this training as a part of your orientation, the clinical educator will provide you a copy of this. It's very important that we get your name on this piece of paper, so I'll go ahead and hand that out at this time. Thank you. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is a very small part, a very small agency associated with the United States Department of Labor. And what they do is they regulate the relationship between employers and employees related to safety and health in the workplace. So they're not interested in what happens in our homes. They're not interested in the environment. Or I shouldn't say they're not interested, but it's just not their area that they regulate. They regulate what happens here on the job. And generally the way OSHA creates regulations is by looking at historical trending from accident and injury logs. How did people get sick? How did they get hurt in the workplace? Where do those problems lie? And if nobody's doing anything to correct those situations, they'll attempt to create a regulation. And that's certainly true with this idea of hazard communication. In so many different industries, we use chemical products. We use them in our home, we use them in medical facilities, we use them in manufacturing. And historically, people did not have access, and neither did employers, truthfully, to quality information in a format that people could understand. And we've paid for that over and over and over again in this country. We could look at asbestos milling and mining operations years ago, and what would happen is the folks that worked there would be exposed to these microscopic fibers in the air associated with the asbestos, which is a mineral. And when you breathe those fibers, if you breathe enough of them long enough, it can cause a set of different lung diseases. And the problem with that is it doesn't hurt. You can't see or smell asbestos. And so the people that worked in those operations didn't really recognize that they were being exposed to hazardous materials. And in fact, if they went to their supervisor on the plant floor and said, hey, we've noticed that when people leave here, they get sick. They get these diseases like lung cancer. Could that be related to something that's happening here? And you can imagine in 1950s American manufacturing, what type of response do you think you would get if you went to your boss and said this? Hey, what is this stuff we're working with? What kind of answer do you get? Yeah, shut up or you're fired. Or how about I'm a line supervisor, I don't know anything about it, which would be true most of the time, correct? A line supervisor in a chemical or a manufacturing plant truthfully didn't know. And by the way, if they did want to help you, there's no format. And bear in mind, there's no internet either. All this is prior to 1986. So there's no internet either, which you're kind of at a stall at that point. Even if you knew the chemical name, you were kind of done as an employee. And at Johns Manville, an asbestos products manufacturer, just as an example, they had a plant physician who was documenting the health effects of asbestos on workers. He wrote papers on it. I studied those when I was in school. And at one point, one of the papers, he made a comment that the company had made the decision not to tell employees of their condition, because many of them already had the beginnings of asbestosis, for example, and the company had made the decision not to tell employees of their condition on the basis that there was nothing that could be done for them from a medical standpoint, and that they should be allowed to work out their years in peace, and the company should benefit from their many years of experience. And some people would look at that and say, well, that's immoral. And it may be immoral, but it wasn't unlawful. You had no duty to communicate hazards to employees, and in fact, there was no format to give them either. And you can see this in so many different industries. Because when we think about chemicals, some hazards are really obvious. If I said, hey, we're going to work with sulfuric acid today, we're going to work with battery acid, everybody go, oh, that can burn your skin, and we need personal protective equipment, goggles and gloves and aprons and things. We all get that. But a lot of hazards are not that clear cut. For example, we could look at, I have a photograph in my office. It's of a group of men in Cape Cod, and they're working a fishing net. And when you were in port, you would mend your nets. And these guys used to get a disease called fisherman's lip. It's a sarcoma, and it's created by arsenic. We used to treat those nets with arsenic so that rats and mice wouldn't eat them. And when you worked a net, you needed both hands free, so you'd hold it in your mouth. And who would have known that? I mean, really, going back in that period of time, who would have known that you could get cancer from holding the net in your mouth as a result of this heavy metal called arsenic? So these are the types of issues that we just run into over and over and over again. So OSHA's idea was that we needed to standardize information. We needed to give employees rights to ask for and receive information. Then we needed a format to give people information in. So employers knew what the hazards were, and employees could respond to that as well. So what every employer in the United States who keeps any form of hazardous chemicals has to do is we have to identify, inventory, and list the chemicals that we use here in the workplace. And then we have to obtain what we used to call material safety data sheets. This is changing. We're now going to a different format called a safety data sheet, and we're going to be seeing these over the next year or so starting to come into the facility. I think these are going to be much more usable than the old material safety data sheets that we used to see for chemical products. One of the problems that we often saw with material safety data sheets, under this rule, OSHA said to manufacturers, if you make a chemical, if you import or distribute a chemical, you must make sure it's assessed. Tell us what the hazards are. Is it flammable, poisonous, corrosive? Put that on this sheet, which is sort of like a label, just in a little bit more detail, and tell us what that is. And that would be the tool that employers could give to employees. We can give you this material safety data sheet when you request it. And we're also going to make sure that all the chemicals are properly labeled with their hazard. The problem with the material safety data sheet, though, is since each manufacturer had an obligation to do the assessment, they came to very different conclusions about the hazards associated with materials. So very large companies with a lot of resources had much more thorough material safety data sheets than smaller companies without a lot of resources. And so the practical meaning of this is I could line up 5 material safety data sheets that all had formaldehyde in them and get 5 different sheets telling me different hazards associated with formaldehyde. And I think we'd all agree that's not good. There should be standard information about the hazards of formaldehyde. And we're a step closer to that with the new safety data sheets. What this process will do is on these sheets, when a manufacturer does their assessment, they say, I'm putting sulfuric acid in my product, which is corrosive. And once they make that determination, the regulation tells them the labels they'll use, the hazard warnings they'll use, things like that. So a lot better standardized information for us moving down the road. We have to have a policy in place that describes how material safety data sheets or safety data sheets will be made available to employees, how the training will occur, and we maintain such a program here at Rubin. The technical and facilities manager is overly responsible for the maintenance of this program, including the maintenance of material safety data sheets. They will be, by the way, material safety data sheets or safety data sheets as we make the transition will be available at the charge nurse's desk in each facility. So it's standardized. If there's a sheet that's not present that you can't find in that book, you can contact the technical and facilities manager and you'll receive one. Also, a copy of the policy is available for your review from the human resource manager as well. So we have a policy, and then we have this duty to tell people that you have these rights. So hazard communication is about material safety, and for the reasons that we said. There are so many complex hazards associated with chemical exposure, and we've seen them in all industries. We've seen them in match manufacturing, where we used to see people their faces misshapen over time. You could tell match factory workers they suffered from a condition called phossy jaw. The phosphorus degraded the bone structure of their face, and so their faces would become deformed from working with it over time. You used to see chrome platers with nose rings before it was fashionable. because the chromic acid vapor they would work with not only caused lung cancer, but it would also burn holes through this portion of their nose. Cosmeticians. So we're not just talking about heavy industry. Cosmeticians have huge problems with chemical exposure. Cornell University did a study of beauticians and said 1 in 5 will leave their field due to health-related concerns. We know they have higher rates of skin disease and lung disease than the general population, and higher rates of bladder cancer. The bladder cancer, by the way, specifically comes from the darker hair dyes, the coal tar pitches that are used in it, creates a greater cancer risk for those folks. So we're not really even just talking about general electric or heavy industry here. It's much broader than that. When we think anybody who works with the material, there's some risk associated with it. And so that's what we're trying to get at, because what we know is that we can work with any material safely as long as we understand it, we understand the hazards, the precautions that we need to take. So the components of this idea of hazard communication, often called right to know, because that's what it gives everybody in this room, a right to know, a right to ask for information, a right to have chemicals properly labeled with their hazards and their name so we can research them and get material safety data sheets. We have these components. We have written policies. We have an inventory of the materials that we use, maintained by the technical and facilities manager. We have safety data sheets available to you. We have labeling of materials, and then finally, training. There's two broad groups of chemical hazards that we think about. We think about physical hazards and health hazards. So physical hazards are things that where you can be burned or blown up or materials that are reactive in some way. And then health hazards are chemicals as a result of getting inside of your body can poison you. And that can happen acutely, short term, or it can happen in a chronic way, long term. And so let's take a look at these. With the physical hazards, we think about combustible and flammable liquids. And so these are materials like alcohol, for example, whose liquid can create a vapor. And let's pretend that this wasn't water. By the way, if it was alcohol, we'd have to have a label on it that said alcohol and that the vapor is harmful and flammable. And so we know that this is water. But if this were alcohol, what's happening inside my container is I have this alcohol, and all these molecules in our alcohol are in motion, and there's a surface tension that's holding this alcohol down. And what happens is every once in a while one of these molecules will get enough energy when it hits another one that it springs free of the surface tension and creates what we call a vapor. So it was a liquid, now it's the gaseous form of that liquid we call a vapor. And if it's a flammable or combustible liquid, that can now be ignited. So the liquid doesn't really burn, it's the vapor that we're really concerned about. By the way, when it does that, when it springs free of that surface tension and creates that vapor, it cools this surface tension. What's that process I'm describing? What do we call it? Evaporation, yes, sir. So it's evaporating, and the warmer it is in this room, the quicker that will happen, right? The faster it'll evaporate. And we'd probably all agree that if I took a match and this was gasoline or alcohol, I could ignite that vapor, right? So that's always of interest to us. Flammable and combustible liquids are hazardous in several different ways. Number one, they're all poisonous. There is no such thing as a non-toxic flammable or combustible liquid. The other issue with them, of course, is that they're flammable, and the vapor is heavier than air. So it sits down and it can create pockets. So one of the things that we need to be very mindful of with flammable and combustible liquids, both in the workplace and in our homes, is how we store them and use them. We never use them around sources of heat, spark, open fire, and we store them in approved flammables cabinets for their protection and also for the protection of firefighters. In your home, you don't store flammable liquids in your basement, correct? Because we said the vapor is heavier than air. If I kick over a can of flammable liquids in my basement, the vapor is heavier than air, and there's often sources of ignition at floor level in our basement, like our hot water heater and things like that. So whenever we're using flammable and combustible liquids, we're looking for well-ventilated areas. We're looking to ensure that there's no spark, flame that could ignite these vapors. We also see compressed gases. And we maintain these in Rubin's facilities and in many other situations as well. And a compressed gas cylinder can be hazardous for a couple different reasons. It can be hazardous because of its content. For example, if it has oxygen in it, Oxygen changes the way everything around it burns, the nature of the way it burns, so it can create a flammability hazard that way. We often in machining areas will also use acetylene. We use oxygen and acetylene together for cutting activities. Acetylene is a tremendously dangerous chemical. It's so unstable you actually can't put it into a steel cylinder. It would just explode. We have to put a special honeycombing structure and nail polish remover in it to stabilize it. And we have to control how slowly or how quickly we allow the acetylene to leave the cylinder, because if I just released it into the air suddenly, it would explode. It's that reactive. But all of these cylinders, regardless of what's in them, are hazardous. And the reason they are is because they're under several thousand pounds per square inch of pressure. So when we think about our cylinders, we always keep them standing upright, secured with a chain and with a valve cap on, because if they fell over and we broke that valve assembly, they will take off like a torpedo. My son watches Mythbusters. He says, "Dad, did you know that one of these cylinders can go through a block wall?" And the answer is yes, I did. I investigated an accident once with a cylinder that there was actually horseplay. People were strapping them to carts and intentionally breaking off the valve assembly and racing them like rocket carts. And one got loose and it took a man's leg off right here before it went through a block wall. They can fly a quarter mile through the air. So these cylinders, we have to treat these with tremendous respect. And we also think about how we store them this way. We have explosives, and we'll talk more about that in a little while. We have oxidizers that contribute oxygen to reactions. We have some chemicals which can ignite when they're in contact with air. These are called pyrophoric materials like potassium metal. Some chemicals are unstable. We used to use a battlefield anesthetic in the United States called ethyl ether, and many of us probably remember that from biology class. We would anesthetize flies with it, and we used to anesthetize soldiers with it as well. We still find great stores of this sometimes underneath buildings where it'll say like civil defense or fallout shelter, and you go down, there's medical supplies, and you'll find these big green barrels of ethyl ether, which is really dangerous because as it ages, it forms organic, they're called organic peroxides. They're light, heat, and shock sensitive explosives. So some chemicals become unstable over time. We also have some chemicals that react with water, like sodium metal. We said potassium metal we ship in oil. If I took it out in a laboratory setting, when it gets into the air, it'll catch on fire, whereas sodium metal is shipped dry, and if it touches water, it can explode. Or some chemicals, maybe if you're old enough, you remember in the comic books, they used to sell those little cannons. They were called calcium carbide cannons, and you would stuff this little tablet in there with water, and it would evolve hydrogen gas. So that would be another like water reactive type of material. So lots of hazards here, lots of physical hazards. We also have a lot of health hazards. The key with health hazards for chemicals are that, number one, in order for you to be poisoned by a chemical, and this is true of pathogens as well, whether we're talking about funguses, bacteria, or viruses, in order to hurt you, they must get inside your body, right? A pathogen that doesn't get inside your body or a chemical that doesn't get inside your body can't hurt you. So in order to cause any of these types of situations, and we're going to go through these in just a moment, a material has to get inside your body, and it has to get inside your body in enough concentration, either at one time or over time, in order to cause these biological changes. So what are the 4 ways that a chemical can get into your body? Breathing it, inhalation, which is the biggest one for adults. How else? Skin contact. Your skin is a pretty good barrier to most chemicals, but not all. Nail polish remover would be an example of this. If you put your hands in nail polish remover, acetone, it's very small moleculed, and it's actually going through the skin into the bloodstream, so you're absorbing that through your skin. Different parts of your body absorb chemicals at different rates, by the way. Your hands fairly slowly because the dense callous skin. Your chest probably 7 times quicker than your hands. Your head maybe 30 times faster than your hands. So your head absorbs chemicals very, very quickly because of the thin tissue. And we've learned from bad experience that other areas of the body can absorb chemicals very quickly as well. There was a man named Dr. Percival Potts in Britain who followed chimney sweeps and documented an occupational disease among these. They were little boys called chimney sweeps cancer, and we used to send those young men up and down chimneys naked, and they would go naked because they were sort of a confined space, and you didn't want their clothing to get caught on anything because customers don't like it when little boys get stuck in their chimney. So they would send them naked, and these boys would get a scrotal cancer called chimney sweeps cancer from the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in the soot. So again, this is one of those things, who would have known that ultimately, and that thin tissue of that area of the body would play such a role, but it does. So we have skin contact with chemicals, we have inhalation of chemicals, which could be gases, vapors, dust, things like that. How else can a chemical get inside your body? Ingestion. And we know we have about 3 to 6 million poison exposures in the United States each year that get called to the U.S. Poison Control Center. It's one of our leading causes of accidental death in the home. And we know that an awful lot of those are going to be young children under the age of 6, these what we call acute poison exposures, where junior ate something, and it happens to adults too, but often children. So this ingestion issue is very big for kids. It is for adults too, though. How does this happen with adults? How does ingestion happen? I don't think that anybody in this room is going to sit down and drink methyl ethyl ketone. How would that happen?
Something mislabeled or not labeled, or spills into something because it's somewhere it shouldn't be?
Absolutely. Something not properly labeled. One of our rules under hazard communication for labeling is that you're never allowed to put chemicals in a vessel that once contained food or beverage for human consumption. Does that make sense? I can't put our disinfecting agents in a coffee cup, for example. That'll create problems. How else does this happen? Yeah, contamination. I used to work in lead factories, and we had real problems with hand washing. We would test people's blood lead levels. We were required to. And sometimes you'd see somebody's blood lead level creeping up, and we'd follow them around to find out what was going on. And often we'd find that it was poor hygiene. Somebody was eating, drinking, or smoking where they shouldn't be. They weren't washing their hands. And you'd ask, well, is that really a big deal if I didn't wash my hands in a lead factory and then went out and ate a sandwich? And the answer is yes, because some chemicals like lead accumulate in your body. Some are metabolized very quickly, some are not. And lead, as an example, accumulates. So we would actually see this as a problem. Something as simple as smoking without washing your hands can give you an increased blood lead level. So we have ingestion, we have inhalation, and we have absorption through the skin. And then the other one is very uncommon, is called injection, which we see, and that usually happens, at least in my experience, and it's not very common. Our hydraulic line breaks on pieces of equipment, where a hydraulic line breaks and it will blow the hydraulic fluid through the tissue. These are nasty injuries, by the way. They're really not fun. So a chemical has to get inside your body, and then you have to have enough of that material inside of your body over time to cause damage. So I could be exposed to a whole lot of something at one time, it could make me sick, or I could be exposed to too much, but a gradual dose over a period of time. And we call those chronic exposures, and that's often what we see in the workplace. A good example, I think, of chronic exposure would be cigarette smoking. We'd probably all agree that if I smoke a cigarette standing in front of you, you won't see anything happen to me. If I smoke a pack a day, every day for the next 20 or 30 years, we'd probably agree that will increase my risk for heart disease and cancer. So that's a chronic exposure, and chemicals can be both. Some chemicals, by the way, are only acute hazards, like chlorine gas. We could fill this room with chlorine gas. We could all die. It could be really dangerous to us. But we don't really think about it as being a long-term health hazard. It doesn't cause systemic poisoning in people. Then we have some chemicals which are only long-term hazards, like asbestos. It's a fiber. It causes scarring of the lung tissue. So I can eat asbestos in front of you. It won't do anything to me. It's really a long-term health hazard. And then we have some chemicals like formaldehyde, which is both. If I drop a bottle of formaldehyde in here, we better run. It will become immediately dangerous to life and health in here if that's concentrated. Or you could be exposed to it over a period of time and develop sensitivities to it. So it could be either. So we have this idea that we have acute poisonings and chronic poisonings. So if a chemical gets into your body in enough concentration, we call this a dose. How much were you exposed to and how long were you exposed to it? There's a safe level for all materials, right? And there's a dangerous level for all materials. You need chromium in trace amounts for proper kidney function in your body, but at higher levels it can cause cancer. Vitamin D is necessary for humans. A quarter pound of it, if you eat it, you're going to the hospital. If you sit down and drink 100 cups of coffee, and I think there's a lot of evidence that coffee has health benefits, but if you drink 100 cups, and I don't think anybody's in danger of doing that, you might get a trip to the hospital, caffeine poisoning. Rhubarb. You sit down and eat 10 pounds of rhubarb pie, you're going to the hospital. Oxalic acid poisoning. So we say the dose makes the poison. It's how much of something we're ultimately exposed to. But once the material's in your body, all body systems are up for grabs. Some chemicals can cause or promote cancer, very few. By the way, there's only 20 chemicals specifically regulated by OSHA as being cancer-causing. Benzene, for example, we know causes leukemia or increases people's risk for leukemia. Heavy metals like chromium or cadmium, we know can cause or promote cancer in humans. But most chemicals can't do this. All chemicals can be poisonous. Very, very few can cause the changes in the body that we think of as cancer. So it's a very special group of chemicals. By the way, our safety data sheet will always tell us if a chemical is a cancer-causing material. And our thought process there is if it is, and we could select another product that didn't have that hazard, we would want to, right? That would be a thought process we'd engage in. Some chemicals are highly toxic by ingestion or inhalation. Some chemicals are reproductive system poisons, and this is true for both males and females. Some chemicals cause damage directly to the performance or function of the male and female reproductive system organs, like lead, for example. Some chemicals cause damage to the genetic information necessary for the creation of life. We call those mutagens. Methylethyl ketone and paint lacquers would be an example of that. So you don't necessarily see illness in the person. You see increased risk of birth defects maybe in their children. Some chemicals, we call them teratogens, from the Latin terata for monster, can cause damage to the fetus directly while it's in a woman's body. And probably the example that we would think of the most in day-to-day life is alcohol that we drink. Right? If a woman drinks too much alcohol, whatever that amount is, during pregnancy, it can cause damage to the fetus. But there's also industrial chemicals that can do that. We know in medical environments, anesthetic gases have posed problems to pregnant nurses and doctors, for example, because it's a gas. It has no form. It crosses the placental barrier. Metals like mercury and lead, things like that, can also cause damage to a baby. We have chemicals that are irritating or corrosive. And these are materials that, because of their pH, are irritating to your skin or ultimately corrosive. And if you remember back to school, we think about the scale of pH. It measures how acidic or how alkaline a material is, and it's a scale of 0 to 14 with 7 in the middle. Pure water is 7, it's neutral. And your hair and skin are just slightly acidic. And so if we move in either direction away from the pH of your skin, things become irritating and then eventually corrosive when we get to the outer ends of that scale. So for example, if I put liquid laundry soap, which is alkaline, on my skin, it'll cause a little pinkness and irritation, which will go away when I wash it. If I put Drano on my skin, it can be corrosive because its pH is so different. And we go down in numbers, and then we start to think about like orange juice and then ultimately battery acid, which is corrosive to our skin. So everything on the two ends is corrosive and can cause destruction of tissue. We have chemicals that we call sensitizers. And so these are materials that you can become allergic to. Right? Now, allergies are, we think of as learned responses. And some chemicals are very good at causing those allergic responses. For example, nickel is a very common allergy for people. If we said to people, is there anybody in this room who can't wear cheap jewelry? Is there anybody? Can't wear cheap. And that's different than won't wear cheap jewelry. Right? Can't wear cheap jewelry. It's a nickel allergy, which is an impurity in base metals. I'd actually gotten away from asking this question. I was in a meeting, it was a group of men, and I made the mistake of asking that question. I said, is there anybody here who has a significant other or a girlfriend or anybody who can't wear cheap metals? And this man said, my wife and my girlfriend, neither one of them can wear. So maybe I shouldn't ask this question. But nonetheless, nickel, formaldehyde is a sensitizing agent. People become allergic to it. It's very common in the American population. Epoxy resins, those like two-part epoxy resins you buy in hardware stores. In industry, about 40% of the workers who work with those will become allergic to those and can't work with them anymore. Also, many, obviously, things that come from nature. Woods, western red cedar, for example, is a primary sensitizing agent. Many people who work with that can't work with it for very long. We have hepatotoxins. These are chemicals that cause damage to the liver, like carbon tetrachloride, which makes sense to us. The kidney and the liver, because of their function in the body, are often the targets of toxic chemicals. Nephrotoxins like, for example, chromium, neurotoxic chemicals. And so these are things that cause damage to the brain. Lead is probably the best known example, but there's many others. Mercury, for example. We don't use mercury in New York State public schools because of its neurotoxicity. it actually causes what appears to be a form of insanity from overexposure. That's where the term mad as a hatter came from, correct? Think about Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter. Why is the Mad Hatter mad? Because he worked in a hat making factory in Danbury, Connecticut. And we would use mercuric salts to treat those hats. And the people that worked there were known to be crazy. And so the people would say he's mad as a hatter. They called those factories, by the way, the House of the Butterflies. Real phenomena. So highly, highly toxic, neurotoxic material. And in all other body systems, your eyes can be damaged by methyl alcohol and windshield washer fluids. We have chemicals that can damage your hearing, like carbon monoxide. We have chemicals that can damage your body's ability to synthesize red blood cells, like lead. So your body's compartmentalized. So when chemicals get in, if they get in enough amount, a certain body system, just by virtue of their form, where they wind up, is likely to be a system that can be damaged. So lots of different hazards. Well, who's ever going to remember all of this stuff? We're not, and that's why we need a system where we have labels and we have pictograms and we have safety data sheets to keep us informed. So we've said this. Chemicals have to get into your body through one of these mechanisms in order for you to be affected. Now here's a question for you. Are we all equal when it comes to chemical exposure? What's your intuition? Are we all the same? Young, old, sick, healthy? Does it make a difference in terms of being exposed to toxic chemicals?
Yeah, some people will be more sensitive.
Yeah.
More liable to be affected.
Absolutely, and for so many different reasons. It could be our body size. Very young children, for example, we know are at much greater risk from chemical exposure than adults. Think about lead. If we're exposed to the same amount of lead, their bodies absorb more of that lead. They eat more, they breathe more pound for pound, they take more out of what they eat and breathe. Also, if I already have a pre-existing medical condition, what if, for example, I was neurologically compromised and I'm exposed to lead or mercury? Would the risk possibly be greater? And the answer is possibly. Sometimes your height can make a difference. If we're spray painting in here, solvent vapors are heavier than air. So they'll sit down here, so the person who's this tall is exposed to more, a higher concentration than the person who's this tall. And we're all genetically different. Everybody in this room brings genetic susceptibilities to the table and genetic strengths. It doesn't matter where you're from. You could be from China, you can be from Switzerland. It doesn't matter where you're from. You bring certain genetic susceptibilities with you. As an example of that is if you're of Jewish descent, you're at greater risk from exposure to a chemical called naphthalene as a result of genetic differences, and at greater risk for anemia as a result of those exposures. And we all have those susceptibilities. Everybody does. So we're not all created equal. And that's an important concept, especially in a medical profession where you share your environment with other people who may not be in perfect health. That's always something to remember. We have very different tolerances for exposure. How do you know if you're being exposed to hazardous chemicals? And I mean, part of that answer is, well, we label things by the container, the things that are present. It says corrosive, you know there's corrosive chemicals present. And most chemicals have pretty good warning properties. They smell, for example. That's pretty common. If you smokes and irritating smells are usually an indication of the presence of hazardous materials. For example, if I brought gasoline in here, I can't bring enough gasoline vapor into this room to hurt you. You'll get up and leave. You're just not going to stay. I could never sneak it past you. It doesn't work that way. Some chemicals, though, don't have good warning properties. Examples of that could be carbon monoxide, the odorless, tasteless gas that's produced whenever something doesn't burn completely. This is the reason we never run engines inside. Gasoline engines are never run inside. We don't run gasoline engines in three-sided structures. We had a farmer die recently this way in a three-sided structure running a generator. Carbon monoxide mixes roughly evenly with the air, and when you breathe it, it likes your red blood cells better than oxygen does and binds to them. So what's being circulated around in your body is carboxyhemoglobin. It's not oxygenated blood. And so one of the things that we think about with carbon monoxide, if you're ever in a situation where people are suffering from headaches and maybe the bluish skin, some of those indications like that, get everybody out of that area and get it tested. Call the fire department or call the utility in those situations. So there are some chemicals that don't have good warning properties, but a lot, by virtue of the containers that are present, the smells, the odors, can be kind of a giveaway for us. So where do we get information about materials? Well, the labels. And historically what we said is everything had to be labeled. And where this came from is manufacturing industry. You could go into a chemical plant and we would have VAT A, VAT B, and VAT C. And so you work there for a while, and maybe you're having a problem with the material in vat A. Let's say it was Keepone pesticide manufacturing. So we go to the boss and we say, hey boss, we've been working with this chemical for a while and we're all talking, none of us are having children. What is this stuff?
So, yeah, right. You tell them.
Yeah, and in the past, though, it wasn't even labeled. Now, by the way, that's very real. The Keepone sterilized many of the employees who worked with it, which would be frustrating. Imagine if you went to your supervisor and they said, shut up and get your sterile butt back to work. Absolutely lawful everywhere in this country until 1986. So this is a very important employee right. Not as important now with with having the internet and access to information, but certainly in 1986 you can imagine the importance of just having something labeled. What is the stuff in vat A? I want to know what that is. And my boss doesn't know or won't tell me. So we label everything now. All hazardous chemical containers have to be labeled with a few exceptions, and I'll talk about those in just a second. And in the past, we always had the name. When a product came to us from a manufacturer, it would have the manufacturer's name. What is the name of the chemical? It's ammonia. What is the hazard? It's an eye irritant. So that's the minimum language we'd get on a label. And then when we transferred that to a new container, and this part's still true, at a minimum, the language that I need to transfer to, like a spray bottle, for example, that has hazardous chemicals in it, is the name of the chemical and the hazard. So I can't just say glass cleaner. Glass cleaner contains ammonia eye irritant. Or I can use pictograms and pictures or numbers to represent that. But we have to have some mechanism where the new container is also labeled with the hazard. This has changed. Remember I said the United Nations has implemented this thing called global harmonization, where they want a worldwide label and safety data sheet. The United States has bid on this, and so by December of 2013, every employee in this country will be trained on the pictograms that I'm going to show you today. And by June 2015, no product will be shipped in the United States that doesn't have the new labeling system. And by the way, you're going to see this worldwide. China, Brazil, Germany, all these places have signed on to this, which I think will create better recognition worldwide. So what's on a label now? We're going to see a picture of one in just a moment. First, we have a product identifier. So this is a code or a set of numbers the manufacturer is using, like a social security number for their product is the way you could think about it for tracking purposes. Because product names, we have like Clorox bleach, Clorox pine scent bleach, Clorox extra whitening bleach, right? There's a lot of Clorox bleaches. So this number helps us. If we were talking to the Poison Control Center, that product identifier will help us. A signal word, warning or danger. In the past, you've seen caution, warning or danger. Caution's gone. There's no caution anymore in the future. You're just going to see warning and danger. Warning for less severe hazards, danger for more severe hazards. A hazard statement, and these are plain language. It will say things like may cause liver damage. So we're not seeing medical terminology, which I think is important. You have a plant employee comes to you and says, Mike, what's a peripheral neuropathy? Right? That's not helpful in a manufacturing environment, is it, if we had that kind of medical terminology as a hazard warning? So these are very plain language, clear-cut statements. A pictogram. And people in medical facilities are used to looking at pictograms. We're all familiar with the biohazard symbol, right? OSHA's biohazard symbol that we see on sharps boxes and red bags and out on our specimen container. That's a pictogram. And it tells you something. It tells you something about the hazard that lies within that container. And there's 9 of these, and I'm going to show them to you. We have precautionary statements. Keep container tightly closed as an example. And then contact information from the manufacturer. So let's look at our label. Here we can see this, and this is the labels of the future. We'll see this product identifier, information about the company, including an emergency telephone number, and we see here some precautionary statements. Use non-sparking tools because it's flammable. Do not breathe vapors. Wear protective clothes. Do not eat, drink, or smoke after handling this product. What to do in case of fire, and what to do in case of first aid. With first aid with chemicals, generally we say, of course, at home that if we had a situation where somebody has been exposed to a chemical, maybe we think Junior ate some aspirin, for example, our math is really, is the person responsive or unresponsive? If they're responsive, we call the Poison Control Center 1-800-222-1222 in our homes. If they're unresponsive, 911, correct? But let's think about this for a moment. What if I have a fairly common injury in many facilities? I'm splashed by a chemical, for example, a corrosive material. We do need to make that call, 911 for example, but is there anything that we should do first? Wash it, flush it, right? So we're looking to get that person to an eye wash station that we have in our facilities with the fountain. And this is really important. We're going to do this before we make the phone call, right? This is an immediate, you got splashed in the face. I'm grabbing her, pulling her to the eye wash fountain. And her intuition is to keep her eyes closed like this because she's had acid or a corrosive material splashed in her face. And we say, no, no, open your eyes like this. Obviously, I take my glasses off. Open your eyes, and we're going to push that fountain, and you're going to hold your face and your eyes specifically in that fountain for a minimum of 15 minutes. We're just going to keep her there until the ambulance comes. We can't over-irrigate her eyes in this situation. And by the way, the good news, when she turns and looks at me as the EMTs are taking her away, you'll see like maybe redness and irritation with an acid. It won't be worse than that later, by the way. That's generally, if we did a good job of flushing, that's going to be it, which is good news. And when you see those horrible disfiguring injuries, and sometimes we see those in the media where somebody, I've seen pictures of women who somebody intentionally threw corrosive materials in their face, and you see those horrible disfiguring injuries. The reason that occurred is they didn't get to water. Water is really the key here. We need to flush, 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 flush. In your home, obviously, you'd get in the shower, and if you had it in one eye, you'd tilt your head, and same concept. We're going to continue that flushing. Minimum of 15 minutes, though, because after a few minutes, you'll say, I'm okay now. No, you're not. You stay right there. So, first aid information. These are pictograms. This happens to be a health hazard pictogram, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And the other one is indicates that the product is flammable. See the signal word? Danger. It's a more severe hazard. And then we have a hazard statement. Highly flammable liquid and vapor may cause liver and kidney damage. That's pretty clear, isn't it? I think that's more usable maybe than some of the things that we've seen in the past. So everything in the workplace that is a hazardous chemical must be labeled. So if it's a water bottle, I don't have to label it. Although, to my way of thinking, if it's a spray bottle like for plants, it wouldn't hurt to write H2O or water on it, would it? So there's never confusion if there's an incident later. The only exception to our labeling requirement is, and it was really created for oiling equipment, if I had a small bottle of oil, for example, and it was going to be under my control all day and nobody else was ever going to touch it, I didn't have to label that bottle of oil when I was going around the plant. But really, in this environment, everything needs to be labeled, correct? And our reasoning here is if somebody has an exposure to a material, we need to know what that is. Or if the material spilled, we have to know what that is, or else we have to treat it as though it's hazardous. I run into this a lot in laboratories. There will be a bottle of white powder. We're doing an inventory, and I'll say, what is this white powder? And the scientist who works in the area will say to me, I think it's sugar. Oh, why don't you taste it and make sure? And oops, it was barium chloride. And that's a problem, isn't it? Because if that spills, we're going to treat that as though it's tremendously hazardous, and if we're disposing of it, we have to treat it as though it's hazardous and characterize it. So labeling is really, really important to us. Making sure that each container, and this is generally only a problem with secondary containers. We got something that came in concentrate, and we put it in other containers. Each of these containers needs to be labeled. Let's take a look at our pictograms really quickly. You're going to start seeing these. And I've given you a handout, these cards, that show them to you. The United Nations had a committee that helped pick these. They did a good job, in my opinion. Most of these pictograms, by the way, are intuitive. This first one's not. There's a couple that are not intuitive to me, but many of them are. You've seen many of these before because they're already on trucks. They're Department of Transportation symbols, and they were picked by the United Nations with the idea that people worldwide would recognize many of them, and that was kind of the concept. The reason this is so important to us, by the way, not everybody reads, not everybody speaks the same language. In my last job, I had a heavy industrial facility in Springfield, Massachusetts, and about 60 or 70% of my worker population spoke Spanish as a first language, and I don't speak Spanish. So this was a real problem, making sure that everybody was familiar with the hazards in the plant. We came up with a lot of different approaches to that, including the use of pictograms, so we were all on the same sheet. So this first one that you see, this is a health hazard. So this is about chronic toxicity, long-term exposure that can cause systemic poisoning or damage to your body. So it's the broken body. And so the types of things that we might see if a chemical was a reproductive system toxin, it could cause or promote cancer, it could cause mutations, it could cause allergies in people, or it attacked a specific body organ. So if cigarettes were regulated by these rules, they would have this symbol. Does that make sense? This is a chronic poison that we're looking at here. It is a health hazard. This one probably doesn't need a lot of explanation, does it? You already see it. It's on trucks and vehicles, and it's the flame. So flammable materials, things that can catch on fire if they were in contact with air, or things that emit flammable gases will have the flame. So here again, we're concerned about sources of ignition and things like that. Can a chemical product have more than one pictogram? Frequently. We already said that all flammable liquids are also poisonous, so that makes sense to us. This one requires explanation, I think. This is the exclamation mark, and this is for acute poisons that are not extremely toxic. So lower level acute poisons. This is something that could make you feel sick if you were exposed to it. So this will always have the word warning by it, right? Not danger. We have a different pictogram for things that are really poisonous. So it can cause irritation of the skin and eyes, maybe cause sensitization of the skin. If you breathed it, ate it, or had skin contact with it, maybe it could irritate your respiratory tract or make you feel sick or dizzy. So it's the exclamation mark. Need to get your attention, but it's not the worst stuff in the world. This is the wine bottle. No, it's not a wine bottle. It looks like a wine bottle, but it's not a wine bottle. This is a compressed gas cylinder, and this is already a Department of Transportation symbol, and you may have seen this before. And remember what we said. What's in the bottle could be dangerous, agreed? It could be chlorine gas, but the bottle itself is dangerous because it's under pressure, and so we need to treat these with tremendous respect. This probably doesn't need explanation. It's a Department of Transportation symbol already, and I think most of us would look at that and say, yep, I get it, battery acid. We can see it burning a hole in the skin and in the bar of metal. It's corrosive. Does this make sense? So right away I'm already thinking about my goggles and face shields and gloves if I was working with this material, and the presence of an eye wash fountain in an area where we would use this. This one probably doesn't need a lot of explanation either. The exploding bomb. So things like blasting agents that we use in construction would be labeled with this. By the way, the explosive that we probably most commonly encounter in our life would be propane gas. It is a true high explosive, and by that, the way we judge how powerful an explosive is when it generates a blast wave, how fast that wave moves. And for propane, that wave moves faster than the speed of sound, so we call it a true high explosive. And that's why we have a lot of rules about it. For example, you'll notice you're not allowed to bring it into this building for storage. I can't bring cylinders of propane in here and store them. We're not permitted to do that. If you think about where you buy your barbecue gas cylinder, it's racked outside, isn't it? They're never inside. They're always outside, and you're not allowed to bring it in to pay for it. You pay for it, they unrack it, and you put it in your car, and that's the reason we're not allowed to bring these inside, because of the explosion hazard. Unless it's in use. There are some exceptions to what I'm saying. For example, if it's attached to a forklift, powering the forklift, we are. This one, I think, requires an explanation. These are oxidizers, the flame over the circle. So we still have the idea, because of the flame, that this has something to do with it's going to make things burn differently or better or cause fires and explosions. And so oxygen itself would be an oxidizer. I think a good example of this, though, from one of my previous jobs would be pool chemicals like HTH. These are corrosive. They'll burn your skin, and they're oxidizers. They contribute oxygen to reactions. And where we see this, I used to have I was in the garbage business. We had our garbage trucks would catch on fire at the beginning of pool season, at the end of pool season, because people would throw chemical products like HTH in the garbage, both at the beginning and at the end of the season. And when that leaked and mixed with the greases and oils in our garbage, it would catch on fire. So maybe 4 or 5 times a week I would have burning trucks coming into our plants because of this HTH. Real problem. Okay. This one probably doesn't need explanation, right? The dead fish and the dead tree, if it gets into the environment, it can cause damage. You'll notice here it says non-mandatory. It's part of the labeling system and it will be used, but OSHA does not regulate the environment. There's a different federal agency that does, called the Environmental Protection Agency, which, by the way, has tremendous power, is more powerful than OSHA in a lot of ways. But they regulate the environment, and OSHA doesn't. So OSHA adopted this system. It is part of the system, and you'll see it. OSHA just couldn't mandate it specifically because they regulate employee safety and health, not the environment. Remember we said the exclamation mark was for like lower level acute toxins? This is for high level acute poisons, things that could be dangerous or fatal. This is the skull and crossbones, and will always be accompanied by the word danger. And we remember this from when we were kids, right? This was in very common use then, and the Poison Control Centers kind of moved us away from this in favor of things like Mr. Yuck because they thought it lost its power. United Nations said worldwide, people get this, they understand what it is, they know, and we want to use it, which I think makes sense. Because everybody here, if we walk into a lab and we see a bottle with a skull and crossbones, we all get the idea. It's silver nitrate, it's highly toxic, don't drink it, yeah. It doesn't require a lot of interpretation. Those are our pictograms. Any questions about those? You're going to start seeing these in the next year or so.
I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
For the oxygen bottles, containers, will they get, because they wouldn't get a flame, they'd get the oxidizer, or would they get both?
Or they could get both. If they're both, they would generally get both.
Well, I'm talking about oxygen specifically, because it's not.
Oxygen would generally get an oxygen bottle. I'm sorry, would generally get the oxidizer symbol, the flame over the circle.
Right.
Yep. Okay, and then finally, we have our material safety data sheets, which are now going to be safety data sheets. So these are a set of pages, could be 2 pages, could be longer, depending on the manufacturer, that provides us additional information beyond the label. So I'm working with a product, I see that it says on the label that it's harmful or it's a health hazard, but I want to know what kind of health hazard. It says it can cause damage to my liver. Well, what does it do exactly? And what exactly is in this chemical product in more detail than the label had? So then I'm going to go to the safety data sheet. And these are located, as we said, by the charge nurse desk in each of our facilities. And if you can't locate it, talk to your supervisor or the technical or facilities manager and we'll get you more information. A safety data sheet, as we're going to be seeing them, will have a set of sections. The first section identifies the chemical product, who made it, and it will tell us, for example, the trade name, the chemical name, and common name. The trade name is Clorox, the chemical name is sodium hypochlorite, and the common name is bleach. So it lists all of its names and who made it. Then we have the hazard identification. And I think one of the things that's going to be helpful with these new safety data sheets is it tells us, remember those hazard statements that we saw on the label? It has those in plain language. It will also have the pictograms in this section. It's telling us the hazard identification. It tells us how it can get into our bodies and how it can make us sick and how much of it we're allowed to be exposed to if it's in the air. Composition, and this is a change. In the past, manufacturers did not have to tell us how much of a chemical was in a product. For example, it could say toluene, but it wouldn't tell us how much, which is really complicated because if it could be 1 part or it could be 99 parts. And to really do an evaluation of a chemical, I need to know how much is in there. Now they're required to tell us exactly how much of the product is made up of hazardous chemicals. First aid measures, if people are overexposed to the material. Firefighting measures. So firefighters who are responding to a bulk spill of the material would know how to fight fires, what kind of firefighting media to use. Accidental release measures. What if we had a spill? How do we respond to that and control it? How do we handle it and store it? Does it need to be in a flammables cabinet? Some chemicals can't be stored together. Like I was talking about, oils and greases and oxidizers need to be separated. Some chemicals are not friends with each other either. For example, acids, nitric and acetic acid, can't be stored together. If they come in contact with each other, it can cause explosions. So here, if there was special handling or storage requirements, that would be indicated to us on the safety data sheet. Exposure control. What type of personal protective equipment do we need to wear if we're working with this material? Physical and chemical properties. What does it look like? What does it smell like? Is it vapor heavier than air? These types of things. How stable is it? We were talking about that ethyl ether. For example, in this section, it would tell us, hey, after a year, you got to get rid of this stuff because it could become dangerous and unstable. Apologize, there's a typo here, but toxicological information. How poisonous is it if it gets into your body and through what mechanisms and what studies have been done on it? Environmental information. How do you dispose of this properly? Most hazardous chemical products can't be disposed of in the garbage. In your home you may be able to do that, but not in a commercial facility. They're often hazardous chemical waste. And so if we're disposing of something that has pictograms on it, we really need to talk to the technical and facilities manager about how to properly dispose of that material rather than just throwing it in the garbage. transportation information for transporters of it, and other regulatory information. Sometimes chemicals are subject to other regulations. For example, in this country, if we keep very large amounts of some materials, we have to report that to local emergency officials, and so that community members can find out about that, because they have a right to know. We have employee right to know, and we have community right to know as well. So, in summary with this, we have chemicals have to be labeled. The organization has a policy that says that you have the right to access safety data sheets and information on any chemical here. Not only the chemicals that we use in this facility, but also our contractors. If a contractor is applying a roof and you're being exposed to that material, you have a right to that information as well. We have this new system of pictograms and labelings that is coming into being that I think is going to be really helpful to us. I think this is going to be a lot clearer for people. I think the pictograms are a good thing. And again, this is a worldwide initiative, so I think there's going to be much better information out there for both responders and for employees as well. So questions about what I've said? Concerns?
I just want to thank everybody for their attention, because these are very important topics. This one and the next one's bloodborne pathogens. These are all going to be mandatory for all staff before the end of the year. And it's part of it, the hazardous communications, hazardous chemicals. And we're going to try to charge the safety committee with knowing about these pictograms specifically and being go-to people, so that if you need, if you have questions about, how hazardous the chemical is, what the precautions are, you can refer to those staff members or myself, of course. But part of this process is we're actually expected to integrate this knowledge that we're getting today into our day-to-day routine. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask. And if you want refreshers on any information that's put out today, please let us know. Thank you.
We have spray bottles with Phoenix, so are we going to get these labels from the manufacturer?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. They will have labeling with the hazards and the chemical name with EPA name and all that on those specific bottles. All chemicals throughout the facility. I would expect that to be completed within the next month.
And we're in a transitional period for these labels. I said that you're going to start seeing these pictograms coming in on labels, and we don't currently have those, and that's okay. It's a transitional period over the next year or so, and right now we're allowed to use, if we had pictograms, that's fine, and we can also just use the good old-fashioned warning contains acetone, flammable, vapor harmful, but everything has to be labeled. And if we find containers that aren't labeled, please point those out. This is important. Labeling is very important. So, if there's no other questions or concerns, then I think we should take a 5-minute break. You folks, yes, sir.
One quick one. As far as the new SDS
Yes.
sheets, now are we going to have to I'm looking at the timetable. We should transition to changing the MSDS over to the SDS by June 1st, 2015?
Yeah, and we're not going to have to do anything. What'll happen, because we're keeping our material safety data sheets, they're part of an exposure record. People here have been exposed to these chemical products, so we're going to keep those. We're always keeping those. But what'll happen is we'll start to have SDSs come in, and so they're just going to be added to our database. So that part's really easy for us. We're just receivers of them, ultimately. It's just going to happen.